Mike McDermott. In this video, we're going to take a look at two more of the Indian campaigns. The first against the Bannock tribe, and secondly, we'll focus on the campaign concerning the Cheyenne tribe. But first, the Bannocks. After an inspection trip to the Fort Hull Reservation in southwestern Idaho in April of 1887, General George Crook wrote, "The apportionment of rations for the supply of this agency was ridiculous, inadequate. The Indians complained that 3 days out of 7 they had nothing to eat, and the agent told me the allowance had never been adequate for the number of Indians who were registered and who were supposed to be fed." Discontent on reservations in the Pacific Northwest became widespread, and agents were concerned by a spate of violent incidents, although the tribes were conflicted. Some individuals who cautioned against violence, and others who urged action. Growing resentment came to a head on the 30th of May, 1878, when Buffalo Horn, chief of the Bannocks, was involved in an altercation with cattlemen who insisted on grazing their herds on the Big Camas Prairie. The prairie was a well-defined area used by the tribe since historic times and reserved to them by the 1868 Treaty of Fort Bridger. So the Camas Prairie belonged to the Indians, and local cattlemen were moving their livestock onto it. Buffalo Horn had previously served as a scout for the Army against the Sioux and the Nez Perce, and understood the ramifications when 2 of the cowboys tending the herd were wounded in a fight. News of the incident soon reached Fort Boise, and General Oliver Howard, commanding the Department of the Columbia, ordered Captain Reuben Bernard with a cavalry detachment to respond. The soldiers reached the prairie on the 2nd of June and confronted about 200 warriors and their families, forcing them out of their camp and into some nearby lava fields. The Indians soon slipped away to plunder a wagon train and kill several travelers before crossing the Snake River at Glenn's Ferry, where they cut the ferry adrift to slow the Army's pursuit. Joined by other Indians and now numbering about 300 warriors, the hostile camp was discovered during the first week of June on Battle Creek by a group of 26 volunteers, who quickly retreated after 4 of them had been killed by the Indians. Chief Buffalo Horn was also killed in that fight, and Chief Egan was selected to replace him. The conflict was widely reported in the press, and more Indians then left the reservation to join the hostiles, whose numbers soon grew to about 800 warriors plus all their families. Several more ranchers were killed before the Indians were located 2 weeks later on Silver Creek in the state of Oregon. 3 cavalry troops commanded by Captain Bernard attacked that camp, and although badly outnumbered, they drove the Indians into rough ground inaccessible to the cavalry. The hostiles were able to move north to the John Day River, where small war parties then began to raid settlers and kill several people, whose deaths were also widely reported, causing panic among the citizens of the region. In the meantime, General Howard had begun marshaling soldiers from garrisons in the states of Washington, Oregon, from Northern California and Idaho to pursue the hostiles, giving them no rest. He was traveling with Captain Bernard's cavalry when they made contact with a camp containing about 2,000 people. Attacking over extremely rough terrain and through heavy timber, the troopers captured a quantity of camp equipment. Several bands were reported crossing the Columbia River on that same date, and 5 local volunteers who attempted to confront them were all killed. While Army units moved to block the Lolo and Nez Perce trails, hostiles appeared on the road between Pendleton, and LeGrand and killed several more travelers. They also threatened the Umafala Agency, where local Indians told Chief Egan that they were interested in joining his camp. While in conversation with the chief, the local Umatilas opened fire and killed him and several other warriors standing nearby. This was Indian on Indian. Chief Egan's head was later brought into the agency for identification. With both of their chiefs dead, the hostiles broke up into small bands, dispersing and attempting to evade the army. Near the headwaters of the John Day River, the rear guard of one group exchanged fire with pursuing troops, and 5 soldiers were wounded before the Indians escaped. Other hostiles were killed or captured attempting to cross the Columbia River, while a series of depredations were committed in the Yakima Valley. In mid-August, hostiles were reported firing on miners along the Salmon River and at the mouth of Bannock Creek on the Snake River. A group of about 100 Indians was attacked by Army troops and driven into nearby lava fields before they escaped. In 1886, northern Indians from Idaho and Nevada were released from the Yakima Indian Reservation to join their western Shoshone brethren on an expanded Duck Valley Reservation. But no matter which reservation eventually became home to the various groups, the mismanagement and the privation that initially caused the war continued for years. At a later date, General Crook wrote, "It was no surprise that some of the Indians broke out into hostility, and the great wonder is that so many remained on the reservation. With the Bannocks, our Indian policy resolved itself into a question of warpath or starvation. And being human, many of them chose to fight." So even the Army leadership, in the person of General Crook, recognized the mistreatment of the Bannock Indians and the way in which the government failed to meet its obligations to care for them once they were on reservations. And now to the Cheyenne campaign. As immigrant traffic across the Great Plains increased, particularly following the California and Colorado gold strikes, the Cheyenne Nation separated into southern and northern branches. The Southern Cheyenne were initially located in eastern Colorado and western Kansas, and then they concentrated farther south in the Indian Territory, what's now Oklahoma. The Northern Cheyenne allied with the Sioux and the Northern Arapaho, and their favorite hunting territories included the Powder River and the Bighorn Country in Wyoming. Northern Cheyenne were camped with Sioux and Arapaho along the Little Bighorn River in 1876 and took part in the battles with General Crook on the 17th of June and Colonel Custer on the 25th and 26th of June. After that fight, the Army transferred additional troops into the region to force the hostiles onto the Great Sioux Reservation. While some Indians surrendered, others already on the reservation slipped away to join the non-treaty brethren after news of the fights in Wyoming and Montana became generally known. Reinforced by 11 troops of cavalry, General George Crook opened the Army's winter campaign in November of 1876. 9 days after marching out of Fort Fetterman, Wyoming, an Indian scout informed him of a large Cheyenne camp in the Bighorn Mountains. Ordered to find and attack the hostiles, Colonel Ronald McKenzie pushed ahead with the cavalry and a mixed contingent of about 400 Sioux, Pawnee, Shoshone, Arapaho, and Cheyenne scouts. The village was located in a canyon on Bates Creek, a tributary of the Powder River, and Colonel McKenzie's troops attacked at dawn on the 25th of November. The Cheyenne had been celebrating a victory over a Shoshone village and were initially driven into the frozen countryside before Chiefs Dull Knife and Little Wolf organized a spirited resistance. The fight became a desperate, close-quarter struggle until the hostiles were eventually forced to retreat, abandoning the camp, which included trophies from the Little Bighorn fight. And this is particularly interesting, I think, because what we see is that Cheyenne camp and the warriors from that camp routinely fought their Indian neighbors, as well as the Army, when the Army made itself available, such as at the Little Bighorn. 200 lodges and all the band's winter provisions and equipment were destroyed, and 700 horses were captured. About 40 Northern Cheyenne, to include 3 of Dull Knife's sons, were killed in the action, while a lieutenant and 5 soldiers died and 26 other soldiers were wounded. The fleeing and unprepared Cheyenne were forced to travel in freezing weather, and after 3 weeks of intense suffering found refuge with Crazy Horse and his Sioux band. Cheyenne warriors joined the Sioux in the Battle of Wolf Mountain on the Tongue River in Montana in January of 1877, but the major losses they suffered in the Bates Creek fight heralded the end of Northern Cheyenne resistance. On the 6th of May, Dull Knife surrendered with his followers at Fort Robinson, Nebraska, and Two Moons surrendered his band at Fort Keokuk, Montana. Other small groups of Cheyenne began turning up at various agencies to be registered and to be accounted for. The Northern Cheyenne expected to live on the Great Sioux Reservation per the 1868 Laramie Treaty, which both Dull Knife and Little Wolf had signed. They were pressured, however, to settle with their Southern Cheyenne relatives in the Indian Territory in Oklahoma. While initially resisting the move, the Northern Cheyenne finally agreed to the government's demands, and on 28th of May, 1877, they began a 70-day trek to the south, escorted by a troop of cavalry. The Northern Cheyenne soon found conditions in the Indian Territory absolutely unbearable. There was no wild game to hunt, and government rations were issued at a starvation level. The Cheyenne were largely ignored by the Indian agent. Living conditions were simply wretched. Sickness was widespread. Dozens of people died during the winter of 1877-78. On the 7th of September, 1878, about 300 people, led by Dull Knife and Little Wolf, made a desperate break to escape the Indian Territory and return to their northern homeland. Cavalry took up the chase, and after a series of inconclusive skirmishes, the frightened citizens of western Kansas mobilized for self-defense after several settlers had been killed. North of the Platte River in Nebraska, the two Indian leaders had a falling out when Dull Knife decided to surrender. Some of the fugitives accompanied him to Camp Robinson, Nebraska, while the rest continued north with Little Wolf to their old hunting grounds in Wyoming. The Army housed Dull Knife and his followers in Army barracks, and for 2 months attempted to talk them into returning back to Oklahoma. The Cheyenne refused, and in an effort to force compliance, the camp commander at Camp Robinson cut off their food, their water, and their fuel. Now this is in the middle of the winter. On the bitterly cold night of the 9th of January, 1879, the Indians surprised their guards with weapons that they had hidden away and were once again fugitives and on the run, trying to get north to their old stomping grounds. They fled and were pursued by troopers who shot individual Indians as they were overtaken on the prairie. About half of the escapees, to include Dull Knife, made it to the Pine Ridge Agency in southwestern Dakota Territory, where they were allowed to stay. So that accounted for about half of the Cheyenne who were on the run. The other half, with Little Wolf, were able to elude the Army all winter. But on the 27th of March, they surrendered to troopers at Fort Keogh in Montana. The Northern Cheyenne held at Pine Ridge were eventually allowed to move to Fort Keogh, and finally, in 1884, an executive order established their permanent home on the Tongue River Reservation in Montana. 3 years previously, before the Northern Cheyenne were forced to move south and relocate to the Indian Territory in Oklahoma, Chief Little Wolf and a delegation of Cheyenne chiefs had been invited to meet with President Grant and key administration and congressional leaders in the United States Capitol in Washington. Little Wolf was presented with a Presidential Peace Medal, a large silver medallion with the president's profile and the words, "Let us have peace, liberty, justice, and equality," engraved on the medal. In his address to the Washington elite, Little Wolf pointed out that in Cheyenne culture, children are raised in their mother's tradition. While his father was an Arapaho, his mother was Cheyenne, and so he had been raised as a Cheyenne. Because of disease and war, the Cheyenne nation was much diminished, but Little Wolf had a suggestion. "My duty is to see that my people survive. To do this, we must enter the white man's world, and our children must become members of your tribe. Therefore," and this is because in his culture, children followed their mother's tradition. "Therefore," says Little Wolf, "we ask the Great Father for the gift of 1,000 white women as wives to teach us and our children the new life that must be lived when the buffalo are gone." It took a moment before Little Wolf was allowed to continue, but he did continue. "For your gift of 1,000 white women, we will give you 1,000 horses, 500 wild horses and 500 horses already broke to be ridden." Well, the chief's proposal was not well received by his hosts there in the Capitol Rotunda. And Julia Grant, the president's wife, supposedly fainted in the ensuing uproar. The cultural gap between the visiting Cheyenne and their white hosts had become glaringly evident to all. And in fact, Little Wolf was still wearing his peace medallion 3 years later when he and his followers made their epic trek from the Indian Territory back to Montana in the dead of winter. And so ended the Cheyenne campaign. I want to thank you for checking out the Indian War campaigns. And until the next video, which will cover the final 2 campaigns during the Indian Wars, all the best to each and every one, and God bless America.